This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this. Hello everyone and welcome to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. My name is Kurt North and this is my final appearance on Season 7 of the X-Files before we move into a particular favourite episode season of mine, Season 8. But before we do that, we thought we'd bring in our resident guest, and that would be Christopher Knowles. Chris, how are things?
Things are great. I'm glad you didn't introduce me as our resident evil. So.
I thought about it, but
should I?
Should I? What was I going to say? Resident? I don't know. There's many things. I'm sure stuff will come out today. But we decided that we're going to do like we've done in the past. You've done it with Carl. Briefly, it was on field trip, but then gave more of a season 6 wrap up from last season. We thought it would be a good idea to bring you back on and to get a bit more in depth on your views and thoughts on Season 7. So, first of all, Season 7, where does it rate for you? Is it up there? Is it down but near the bottom? How do you rate Season 7?
Well, I'll tell you, like at the end of Season 7, and for a while, it was one of my favorite seasons. And I look back now and I'm like, what was I thinking? You know, it's just one of those kind of things where you just sort of like you become in sync. Like it's almost like your life sort of syncs up with, a television program somehow. And so it did that for me. And but I also really, was a real big fan of the mythology episodes in that season. I thought they were the best mythology episodes the show had done in a long time. And there are some really great standalones too. The biggest problem looking back now is that the tone is just all over the place. It's anarchic, chaotic. I think they just were very uncertain because everyone assumed that it was going to be the last season at that point in time. Everybody was exhausted. David and Jillian were just like beyond frazzled, and the assumption on set was just like, this is it. Let's just wrap everything up. And then the show got renewed because Doug Herzog came on at Fox and just made a complete mess of the network. And they needed something that people were going to watch in that slot because he came in saying that, Fox is going to be the comedy now because he came from Comedy Central, right? And his idea was like, they're going to be like the broadcast Comedy Central. We're going to do half-hour comedies, cheap to produce, so on and so forth. And everything he put on pretty much failed. I think except for Malcolm in the Middle was the only thing that actually went anywhere. So, he didn't like 1013. He thought the shows were too expensive. He had a personality clash with Chris Carter. I strongly suspect, I don't know if you've ever seen the series Action, but that was his baby. And I think there was a lot of pot shots being taken at Chris Carter in that series. It was very short-lived, but when I went back and watched those episodes, I'm like, yeah, this seems a little familiar. So there was obviously animosity between the two, and then of course there was the Harsh Realm episode or incident. I mean, everybody knows how I feel about Harsh Realm. Harsh Realm is the kind of show you make when you're just exhausted. I mean, you are just exhausted beyond exhaustion. But you have to do something new because of your contract, Yeah. It was just a disaster in every way, shape, and form. And that really caused a huge rift between Carter and the network. David, opened the season by announcing he was suing Fox and suing Chris Carter as a co-defendant because of the FX deal. If you're not familiar with that, your listeners aren't familiar with that. basically what happened is that Fox had, instead of shopping the syndication rights for the X-Files, had basically given themselves a sweetheart deal with their cable network FX. And it reminds me a lot of what we saw recently with Scarlett Johansson and the Black Widow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's like the same kind of deal. So, I mean, he had sued thinking that he was, his share of the royalties were being undercut, and Fox was just basically paying themselves. And, and Chris Kreider was like really personally hurt by that. Like he felt that, he wasn't involved in that kind of stuff. It's really amazing what a lot of people will blame on him or 1013. How much of that was really the network? I mean, he worked for the network. The network was in charge. The network made the decisions, I mean, the network had to approve every script, right? They had to approve the casting. I mean, they had to sign off on pretty much everything. Mm-hmm. So Carter was very hurt, because he and Duchovny they're very good friends now. I mean, they had like a sort of a split, a rift for a while, and then they became very good friends in the early 2000s again. And I think for a while they were living next door to each other.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I don't know if they still are, but they were very close friends. And Carter, he felt very hurt by it, and I can understand that. And unfortunately, that all the jackals in the press sort of came after the show, because now they've got a new story, because they love to take down things that they've built up, right? The press just loves to do that,
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can see that in loads of things, can't you?
So anyway, so the press turned on the show. I think people at 1013 were not really paying attention to what was going on the boards too much. And I don't think they realized, since the internet was still pretty young then, I don't think they realized that this was not like a representative group. You know what I mean? This wasn't a representative sampling of the fandom. I mean, this was a very, 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 very tiny sliver of the fandom.
Yeah.
So, but that did add a lot of noise. It added a lot of dissension, between the fandom and the series. And, I think that that's something, in the next season with the casting of Robert Patrick and Annabeth Gish, you know how Vince Gilligan is. He's like a real nice guy. And he doesn't like to say anything bad about anybody, but he has gone out of his way on many an occasion to say how angry he was at the fans for how they treated Robert Patrick and Annabeth Gish in those last two seasons. So, I mean, it was an interesting time. You had some new writers. David Amon was really kind of shaping up. He was doing some really good work. And then you had all the guest writer things. You had like William B. Davis wrote an episode, and Gillian wrote and directed an episode, and David wrote and directed another episode. But, in the case of David and Gillian and Chris Carter's notorious Fight Club, I think they're all just sort of using this show to take shots at one another, so to speak. And if you go back and watch those episodes, you can kind of see that. So, I mean, it was a very interesting time. I mean, David and Gillian, legitimately hated each other at that point. It wasn't just like they weren't getting along. It wasn't just like, I mean, they legitimately hated each other. And, if you've read William B. Davis's, he said, people would leave the show because they just couldn't stand all the animosity. It was just ruining the atmosphere. So, but at that point, it was really bad. Yeah. But I think there are some great episodes. I mean, I really do. I mean, like I said, I really enjoyed the series quite a bit. And, one thing that I really enjoyed, if they finally figured out how to shoot in Los Angeles, they didn't know how to shoot in season 6, and the show just looked ridiculous. It was either like too dark or too bright. But they started using the C-stands I think Bill Rowe came up with that idea. Bill Rowe came up with the idea is like, how do we deal with this glaring sunlight beating down on us all the time? And his idea was to build C-stands, right? Which is just sort of like these contraptions that they use on set, and to attach tree branches to them. You know what I mean?
Right.
So you can see that a lot. I mean, it's funny in season 8, you can see it like in the scene when they're in the bottom of the little mesa there. And like, where are these like tree shadows coming from? But so I think there was a lot of really good work being done. I think the episodes that don't work is when they're just trying too hard. They're trying too hard to break the mold. They're trying too hard to stretch the envelope. And I think at that point in time, when the series is as old as it is, and everybody working on it is as tired as they are, that's not the time to like try and stretch the envelope. That's the time to sort of regroup.
Yeah, consolidate,
which they did in the 8th season. But the interesting thing is that, I've read interviews, before the series started, where Chris Carter was saying, we want to get back to basics, we want to get back to like sort of what we do best and, telling the scary stories, which is his like little mantra there. So really what they did in season 8 is at least what they intended to do in season 7. But there were just so many problems. There were just so many things popping up that just, lawsuit, for instance. So there was just so many things going on that just made it impossible. And the other thing too, if you've never been to Los Angeles, you can't appreciate this, but Los Angeles is really one of the most poorly planned cities in the world. And their traffic is just, it's a national embarrassment, and, that's why they had such a bad smog problem, because they're ringed by the San Fernando Valley, and all that exhaust and all that other stuff just doesn't, it's hemmed in by the mountains. I remember one time I was out at Disney at Burbank. It's like, I think 90 or 92. I've been out there a few times, but like I'm in the Disney building in Burbank, and I think it was like 14 or 15 floors up. So it wasn't that high up, but you could just see, like, just hovering above the street level was like this greenish brown pea soup. This disgusting, accumulation of like dust and smog and it's just really gross. So, but the thing is that like, so not only do they have the problems with lighting it, but they just, like the logistics of getting around the Los Angeles area is something that people just don't appreciate. You know what I mean? Like when traffic hits and it's basically a parking lot and you just can't move for like an hour. So I think that really hurt the show. So there were a lot of logistical things that really affected the show. Vince Gilligan talked about how it was more expensive to do. And, the one thing he said, this is really interesting because, the main writers were all writer-producers, right? And he said, one thing I noticed when we got to LA is that we just had a lot less time to write. You know what I mean? Okay. We had a lot less time because we're dealing with all this other stuff. We're dealing with all these logistical problems. And, plus the unions in Los Angeles, they, at that point in time, when, the gravy train was still riding high, the unions were calling the shots. So they're not anymore, certainly. But this is why a lot of shows started moving to like Atlanta and, other states because of the unions in LA. He said it was just really difficult because you just had so much more work to do and just like things that had nothing to do with creating something, just like logistical, because somebody's got to do it, right? It's like the chain of command, like, I don't know, the gaffer has a problem that they can't get, the wiring they need. And he complains to the line producer and the line producer complains to the producer. And then it ends up, with, either Chris, Frank, Vince, or John Scheiben. They're the ones who have to make the final decisions on that stuff, or Kim Manners or somebody. So, it's just a real problem. Interestingly enough, it was easier for the actors because you didn't have the weather to deal with. They were having to do fewer reshoots, and they were just having an easier time doing the actual shooting because of the weather. So, both David and Gillian said, the thing they really liked about moving to LA was because of that. They didn't have to spend as many time because there were episodes in Vancouver where they just have to stop filming for days because, the place they were filming got washed out. And if you're following what's going on in the news now, Vancouver is now cut off from, the Fraser Valley got flooded and it washed out the highway and the trains and everything like that. So they're having some major problems there. It's actually kind of frightening. So that's how it goes. But the show got more expensive. It got more difficult for the producers to deal with. The ratings were going down. And here's another thing that I think people don't really appreciate is that the ratings started dropping like in the 6th and 7th season, because the X-Files finally had like serious competition in that time slot. They had Alias on ABC, right, which was cutting into a lot of the sort of X-Files audience, and then The Sopranos on HBO.
The Sopranos is the one I'd noted down, actually, to say, you know, that was a part of Melting Pot in the way the X-Files actually delivers that, because it's become such a big show that, as you say, it would pull in audience from a 6-7-year-old show.
Yeah, you know, 6 or 7 years, particularly for a Fox show, that's like ancient. You know, that's like Methuselah. So I think with the aging of the show, the problems, the lawsuit, the assumption that this was the last season, and then, like, you know, Sopranos had become appointment television on Sunday at 9:00, right? So it was like headwinds, you know, like the X-Files had, you know, the wind at their back for so long. And then as soon as they get to LA, you know, their luck runs out.
So just a couple of things that you mentioned there. So, because I'm just, season 7 is intriguing because of this and a lot of what you've said there, that you've got Millennium being cancelled. You've got a lot of stuff like, say, for example, Orison, Signs and Wonders, Brand X, things like that are in the boiling pot that's kind of like filtering through maybe some Millennium ideas. I don't know if you know anything about that at all, but it feels like there's elements to that for me, especially rewatching these and doing some of the podcasts that I've done, especially given me doing The Time Is Now. I found so many like allusions to that.
A lot of the actors too.
Yeah. So like in Brand X, for example, it has the guy who plays Alistair Pepper, for example. So there's things like that happening. You see the David and Gillian stuff, the Chris Carter stuff, the lawsuits, things like The Sopranos and taking an Alias, taking that away from it. It just seems that there just seems to be so much in the boiling pot. I mean, even like the mythology. You mentioned the mythology at the beginning. The mythology is pretty much like parked, but it's fascinating. The 6 Extinction stuff and the Xenonzite closures, I think, is fantastic. And then building up to Requiem, which is a distillment, a concentration of everything the X-Files is. I find really fascinating that everything you could potentially throw at the X-Files in its 7th year. You see, and one of the things I was going to ask you, which you've already mentioned, is it is the second season in LA. They are trying to find stuff like, I'll mention Brand X again, the darkness, and you're saying about some of the lighting and the way that's done. It feels like it's proto season 8. It does feel like they are finding their feet. So I do find it fascinating that there's so many things in this boiling pot of the season itself.
There are, and that's what makes it interesting, because, you know, there are seasons. Well, I mean, every season of the X-Files was pretty momentous in some ways. You know, I mean, there's always a story there. You know what I mean? There's always something to think about or to write about. I guess maybe season 9 is just sort of like, you know, it's just almost like a coda to season 8. You know, it's just like the postscript. So, you know, and people weren't paying attention. So maybe in that regard, I mean, there's a lot of season 9 episodes that I really like, but I think there's not really much to talk about in that season because it's the wind down. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I can see it in that regard. And, you know, in season 4, you know, all the onus was on Millennium, at least in the first half of the season. But as far as like those millenniumistic aspects that you're talking about, you know, Carter, I think that really, you know, I think Millennium really spoke to him in ways that maybe the X-Files didn't, because, you know, it's like that Baptist upbringing that he has, and he's bringing a lot of that into the stories. And, you know, it gets to the point that people are complaining when I Want to Believe come out that it's just a Millennium movie. And it's like, well, that's kind of what I like about it.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So, no, I think Millennium was just like, I think thematically and conceptually, it was very near and dear to Carter's heart. I think the problem is that the show just wasn't gaining traction the way he had hoped. And, but, you know, like I said, I mean, starting in season 6, and certainly in season 7, you're starting to see a lot of the people that were you know, like sort of your day players, almost like from Millennium, show up in the X-Files. I mean, John Hawkes is a perfect example, right?
Yeah.
And also, what's her name? Michelle Joyner, who is in the Well-Worn Lock, shows up in, not Arcadia.
Chimera.
Chimera, yeah. You could call either one, right? The names are just completely interchangeable. But so I think that just shows really where Carter's thinking is. And the one thing that I think too is that I think he's writing a lot more in season 7 than he was in season 6. I mean, you can really hear his voice and sort of his tics and sort of his obsessions and prefixations in season 7 that you weren't really hearing as much in season 6. But I gotta say, I think everybody, it's funny because like everybody goes, oh, I don't like Fight Club. Chris Carter's like the worst X-Files writer. It's like, wait, this is the guy who wrote like Six Extinction, Sign and Sight and Closure and Requiem. I think that's some of the best writing in the history of the show. I mean, that's I think it had a lot to do with me really tuning into this episode because, those 5 episodes I just really, really connected with. I just really felt it. And it's interesting too that the mythology. So they were trying to. It wasn't like a new mythology. People always think that when they got rid of the syndicate, that was the end of the mythology. It's like the end of the syndicate. You know what I mean? and I've said on many occasions that I didn't miss them. I think that it was kind of a mistake by having them as prominent as they were, because it took a lot of the mystery out of the conspiracy. But what they really wanted to do, and what Frank and Chris talked about, is like they wanted to start like a new phase in the mythology. And the reason I think they latched onto the whole ancient astronaut stuff that they sort of started alluding to in the end and in the beginning is that they sort of wanted what I think they wanted to do, and I think they've sort of spoken to this, is I think they wanted to pull it all together and say, like, all the monsters and stuff, it's because of like we have alien DNA, and they've said things like this, like I think it was Frank, he said, it's like all the no, it was Chris said, every episode is a mythology episode. And then, Frank had gone on to say that, like, the whole idea behind all the monsters and stuff that they talked about in meetings and stuff, and you really didn't see until Founder's Mutation in the 10th season, was that all this stuff is happening, all this phenomenon is happening because we have alien DNA. All right. So, again, I mean, James Wong sort of came in and made that very clear. Personally, I would have liked if they had done that from the beginning. You know what I mean? Because it gives the show just a lot more unity. You know what I mean? But Carter had this thing where he didn't want to overplay the mythology because he felt if you overplayed the mythology, it just starts to become another show. That you needed the balance of mythology and standalone, to give the show sort of like a balance. And I mean, I agree with that, but I think what would have been a better way to do that, from the beginning, was just link the two together so people understand that they're not watching two different series. It's what, go, oh, I like mythology, I like the standalone. It's like almost like people are talking about two different television programs. They're not. It's the same program. I just think they should have made that clearer. But I think they wanted to, but I cannot for the life of me figure out why they just dropped that storyline. And I do think a lot of it had to do with David. I think David just was like, this is stupid. And I think that shows up in Hollywood AD that, so many elements from the Sixth Extinction show up parodied in Hollywood AD, but also, the zombies from Millennium. I've always said that Hollywood AD is actually, X-Files after David. AD is after David, that he thought the show was just going to become like this ridiculous Hollywood action thing without him. And, it's just kind of like, a little narcissistic. But I think what the Sixth Extinction was pointing towards, and sort of almost, it's like they didn't even finish the storyline within the storyline, because in Memoir Fati, David sort of takes over and makes it a whole different story. But I think they were going to lead to some like a zombie apocalypse thing. And I think those storylines sort of just was seen in Millennium, and they I think they retooled it. I think the whole idea of the zombie apocalypse morphed into the super soldiers, because the super soldiers really are zombies, right? But they're like, it's zombies meets Terminator meets Invasion of the Body Snatcher.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. Just speaking about Millennium while we're talking about that, the Frank Black episode, I always found it fascinating in this season, just with the actual writing of that episode, that, it's not a Millennium episode. It's not really an X-File episode. It's kind of some quasi kind of thing. But the fact that there's 14 hours left into Armageddon and they're just sauntering around, I find that really fascinating. It's just like, yeah, well, the stakes are really that high, and we end up doing, doing what we do with 4 zombies in the basement. I know Darren and I had a great fun talking about that.
It's a really good episode up until that last act. I mean, I think it's a really good episode because it's not really about like the apocalypse is imminent. It's about like a bunch of people who are dangerous think the apocalypse is imminent. That's what it's really about. It's not like the actual apocalypse is imminent. It's like, oh, it's coming. But these people, it's the whole owls and roosters kind of idea. So like, I guess those zombies would be like, the rooster faction or whatever. I don't think they really wanted to go into that aspect of it. But,
no.
I think it's a great, I really do. I honestly, legitimately think it's a great episode until it ends up in that stupid basement. And that's just the kind of thing where it's like, how do we end this? I don't know. Let's just have them shoot zombies in the basement. And it's just like, really? That's your idea? Well, you know what? We got to get the script in an hour, so let's just do it. I know Frank hated it. I mean, not Frank. Lance Henriksen hated it. He hated that episode. He just, and it's interesting too because he blamed it on Chris, and I'm like, I think that was really Frank's show.
Mm.
I don't think Chris Crowder really had much involvement in that. I think, because they were really co-executive producers at that point in time, and they're co-showrunners, really.
I mean, what do you make then to the fact that Thomas J. Wright directed that episode, so he's Mr. Millennium as a director, but you've got Frank and Vince doing Millennium, but then later on, just like 3 or 4 episodes later, you've got Orison, which was done by Chip Johannesson. Now, I know there's obviously some rewrites and things like that, and I, again, speaking to Darren about the fact that the episode's entitled Orison, but he's hardly in it. The fact that you're given someone who's been looking after Millennium for so long an episode 3 or 4 episodes after Millennium, what do you think to that?
Well, it just speaks to what I was saying. I said, Millennium was near and dear to Chris's heart, and I think that if he had his druthers, he would have pulled more of Millennium than he did into the X-Files. I think he sort of wanted to just take all those ideas from Millennium and bring them into the X-Files. I got to disagree on Orison. I love that episode. And, it reminds me of Apocalypse Now. Right? I mean, Brenda's in 8 minutes of that movie? But it's
I suppose, yeah. Yep.
But it's like the entire movie is like leading up to those 8 minutes. You know what I mean? It's like, so when those 8 minutes happen, it's like, you don't think, oh, that was only 8 minutes. What the hell? It's like, it was the climax of the story. And I think in the same regards, it's like, Orison is really the prime mover in that story. Donnie Pfaster is just basically acting in Orison's morality play, basically. So I think that it works, really. I mean, I love that episode. I make no bones about it. But the other interesting thing about season 7 too is that Rob Bowman leaves. And I think he only does 2 or 3 episodes that season. And, that was a huge deal. He also, that same year, he did the Lone Gunman pilot too. So, when it shows up the following year, it seems like he was still on staff, but he wasn't. He had left after NME. And I think that was a huge shift in the show. I think that signaled a big change, because I think, as far as the shooting and the directing and so on, I think it became much more, Kim Manners' sensibility, Rob Bowman was almost, he was almost like your kind of like quasi Kubrick in a lot of ways. It was like everything was a widescreen and just almost like the impassive eye. You know what I mean? Where Kim Manners is like, oh my God, it's like, he's like crying while he's watching the dailies, because he's just so emotionally labile, So I think that that had a big influence on the show. Everybody's going, why is, Scully always bursting in tears? And it's like, I think a lot of it has to do with Kim Manners. Like Kim Manners had to be talked out of having David burst into tears when Samantha shows up, right? And I think that maybe it got a little soapy for some people, and maybe it did, but I think a lot of that is Kim Manners' influence, because he also became more involved in the storytelling. For instance, Existence, right, was basically co-written by Chris and Kim Manners, because Chris had written a script and Kim Manners had kind of said, this isn't going to really work on, it's just, we need to expand the palette a bit more. You know what I mean? So they'd rewritten the script together. But, Kim was always in on the tone meetings, right, when he was directing. And I kind of wonder if he was in on the tone meetings when he wasn't directing. I mean, maybe he was too busy. But like I said, his sensibility really starts to inform that show, just like very emotionally charged, where Rob Bowman was more like,
cinematic and
But it's funny because like even an episode like just imagine what Memento Mori would have been like if Kim Manners had directed and not Rob Bowman. Rob Bowman is always like just sort of pulling back when things start to get emotional. It's almost like he brings the camera back instead of going in for that kill, the ECU kill, and he's always sort of bringing it back. It's almost like like a passive observer. So I think that had a huge effect on the show. I don't think that Enemy is one of his more effective episodes. I like that episode, but I wouldn't like say, oh, you got to see what this guy could do on television directing. I would never show anybody that episode because to me it's just very efficient but extremely unspectacular.
While we're talking about NME, then, so obviously that was written by William B. Davis, and
in air quotes.
With maybe some significant rewrites, but the kind of arc for Smoking Man in this season, just in canon, from the fact he was taking Mulder's DNA, then gets ill. We see him in Enemy and slightly ill, and then obviously what happens in Requiem. That in itself is an interesting push on like the old mythology moving forward as well, isn't it? I mean, especially with William B. Davis doing that episode and wanting to do certain things, and it obviously becomes a much more interesting development when we get into seasons 10 and 11. I'm trying to.
Word, right? Diplomatic.
I'm not ready to discuss that just yet. We'll wait till we get there. But it is an interesting arc for Cigarette Smoking Man in canon in the actual show itself, isn't it? During the course of season 7, they just filtered through the background for him.
Well, he's the devil, right? It's the hero's journey. It's almost like they really play up the Christ-like stuff in Sixth Extinction MR5T, but it's kind of like he's the devil, right? And it reminds me. I don't know if you're a Supernatural fan at all. But Mark Shepard had played Crowley, who's the devil. And he just asked to be written off the show because he wasn't doing anything. Right. They'd resolve sort of this big, the apocalypse of du jour. I mean, every season ends the same way. But he's like, I'm not doing anything. So I think with William B. Davis, it's like, what's he going to do? He was the prime mover. He was the action man of the syndicate, right? And the syndicate had gone. So what's he doing? And it's almost like the same thing with Krychek. Krychek is just sort of like the in and out man, and what's he doing? What's he doing in the show? It's like, but the idea was at the end of season 7 that Krychek kills Cigarette Smoking Man, and then he and Marita use like his network to rebuild the syndicate. And that was going to be the focus of season 8, before the whole super soldier thing really took over. And what had happened is that Laurie Holden signed on for another show, and they just couldn't do it. And so I don't begrudge her for doing that. I mean, I wouldn't begrudge her anyway, but does she want to play like 6 or 7 episodes in a season of the X-Files, or does she want her own show? Obviously she wants her own show, right? So, and nobody even remembers what show she was on. It's like, wait, what was that? I mean, people remember her for like Walking Dead and Silent Hill, but nobody remembers anything else she's done.
She's in The Boys now, apparently, I think, isn't she? She's just been declared as the Scarlet Witch kind of play on the Scarlet Witch.
So is Jensen Ackles. So it's like, they're kind of like feeding off that whole little nexus there. But so, Cigarette Smoking Man, he becomes, he's not even like an irritant, I mean, he's very, very passive in Sign and Sight and Closure. But I find that really interesting because it's like, he can't do anything anymore. He doesn't have the power to do anything anymore because his resources have been destroyed.
Yeah.
So I really like that about that.
You're talking about Chris Carter in the background of season 7. Do you think that that kind of echoes the likes of Sign and Sight and Closure with the walk-ins from Red Museum and things like that? That's an example of Chris Carter behind the scenes of returning to stuff that has been percolating over the years.
Well, what I've said before is that I don't think the walk-ins are actually real. And I think the walk-ins is just a cope. I think, these parents lost their children. They don't know what the hell happened. And this whole walk-ins thing just becomes a cope. It's just like, oh, well, these spirits turn them into starlight. You know what I mean? Yeah. And you can kind of see that. I mean, one of the things I really like about Closure, first of all, because Anthony Hild, I think, gives one of the best performances I've ever seen in my life in any medium. But, when he sort of turns from this like wise sage into like this, panicked, hysterical schizophrenic and at the drop of a hat, because, Mulder doesn't buy into his fantasy anymore. So I think that, I think Carter was using that, and there's the callbacks, because they have Mark Ralston, who was in, Red Museum. But I think that, like I said, I think that one of the ways I think you can really appreciate the X-Files is almost sort of seeing as like this, almost like this quasi dream reality that these characters are wandering through. And it's just like, if you take that point of view storytelling to its logical determination, it's like, this is all their perception. So it's like, you just got to figure out who's telling you this story. And then you can sort of judge what is actually happening. I mean, that's what I do personally. So the way they shot the show, like, we talked about how like the cinematographers really stepped up and fixed a lot of the lighting problems that they were having. And I know Rob Bowman was involved in that too. It kind of gave it that dreamy, almost like magical reality kind of vibe, and again, that's something that I really tuned into. And, that's sort of played with throughout the season too. One of the things with Hungry, which, I mean, I just think that's a flat out 5-star episode, no matter how you cut it. People might disagree with me, but it's like, it's this weird nightmare that this guy's having, that these horrible FBI agents are showing up and ruining his life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, the way the point of view is flipped in that episode, I think is really brilliant. And I, the way Bowman shoots the climax of Orison, I just think is phenomenal, because it's like, Scully like looks at the gun and is like, did I shoot him? It's like, am I one? Like, what is my reality? She obviously just shot him, but she's just like, she didn't even realize it. And the way it's shot, it's like, you don't know if she's doing it or, you know what I mean? It's just like, that's clearly that at the very least, that last scene is being shot from her point of view. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But she sort of sees Mulder come in and all that kind of. So, I mean, that's, like I said, that's something that I really, really liked, because I love that kind of like almost like Lynchian dream reality vibe in any context. And I think, putting it in the X-Files context, I just thought really worked. I really do. So even like some of the weaker episodes, and there certainly are a lot of weak episodes, but it almost seems like they're sort of carried by the other episodes. If that makes any sense. Except for Fight Club, which is just like temper tantrum. Like it's just flat out like just Chris Carter attacking his stars. And it's not even like he's attacking them like he's their boss. It's just like it's like these three friends dumping on each other, but the only difference is that they have like a multi-million-dollar apparatus to have their little tantrums at each other. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, Carl, Sarah, and I had a really interesting discussion on Fight Club. Little things like the when Mulder goes down the drain, says, what was he doing down there for all that time? Because he's like there for like a day and a night. But yeah, one thing I noticed, I'm talking about that Lynchian or the kind of stylistic approach. We've had the likes of like Matrix at this point, is the use of time. There's a lot of episodes like Rush. You mentioned. Xenon's Enclosure, where they slow down time. There's a lot right through, and something I've noted right through all my episodes that I recorded. Orison obviously slows down with the music. You've got All Things, it slows down with Moby, and obviously using contemporary music as well. It seems that depending on how you view it, but I always found it really interesting that we're getting to the end of season 7. You said that like season 7 gets to a point where it's like, everyone thinks it's going to end at this point, and it almost like seeps through the show in that way that there's a lot of slow down time. There's a lot of like different aspects to the way that the thing is aired. Requiem, right at the end, the abduction takes an age, so there's a lot of stuff like that seems to be seeking through the cinematography as well.
No, I agree with you. And I think that's kind of like maybe directors and cinematographers, like Bill Rowe and whoever else was shooting, Michael Watkins or Kim Manis, whoever, thinking like, this isn't that great a script. What can we do to sort of pump this up a little, punch it up a little? How can we give this a little more pizzazz? And, that's what happens. But, one of the things you didn't mention was, as far as the time thing was, All Things, and that's what it's basically all about,
Yeah.
So you have that aspect, running either explicitly or I guess maybe implicitly, right, throughout the series. I'm just looking at the sequence of episodes and just like, oh my Lord, it's like it's just all over the place, as far as like, you follow up the Amazing Marlene, which follows Horizon, and is followed by Signs and Wonders. It's like, these two sort of very millennium, almost like Old Testament vengeance kind of narratives. And then, you have like this goofy story about like fake magic,
Yeah, in the middle.
But here's the thing. I really like the Amazing Marlene. But again, the interesting thing about the Amazing Marlene is that it's kind of almost looking at the same problem through a different lens. It's, it's all about like perception and reality and how perception is manipulated and how reality can be manipulated. I mean, does that sound, it sounds like a little film school 101, but, I really get that sense. I mean, Goldberg Variation is a legitimately terrible episode, right? At least in my reckoning. And it's funny because like when I bought the box sets, a couple years after I didn't even remember that episode. It's just like, it flew right out of my head. But again, it's also kind of the same thing. It's almost like a Twilight Zone episode. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's just like, you remember like when they did the Twilight Zone for an hour and it's just like, why are they doing this for an hour? You know what I mean? It's just like, it works so perfectly in that half hour format. But, some of these episodes do, they're starting to get very Twilight Zone. Certainly the Goldberg Variation is very Twilight Zone-y.
Yeah.
And
would you say there's more in season 6 than there is in season 7 though?
No, I would say there's more in season 9 than anything else. Okay. Season 6, it's almost like a lot of the episodes, they're just throwing a party for themselves,
Right. Yeah.
It's very self-referential, and it's very like, oh, now we're doing this, we can do anything. So watch us do this, it's that kind of deal. I think, they just ended up pulling out too many rabbits from the hat. And, it has to be said that a lot of people did not like, what they call X-Files light, and that's sort of what these seasons are called. And I'll tell you, that first run of episodes in season 6, I was like, why is Ed Asner and Lindley Tomlin on my show? What is this, like 1972? And I'm watching them appear on the Carol Burnett show or something? It's just like, Chris Carter had that real sort of 70s TV nostalgia that Morgan and Wong had as well. But yeah, I think they are sort of playing a lot with reality and perception, because Ex-Cops is about reality and perception, right?
Yeah.
First person shooter. You know what I mean? I mean, even Thief, it's all about like this guy who's, Thief always seems like, sleepless. And then you have Pusher and Katsunagari, it's just like, and then someone called, why am I blanking on the name? Because I'm trying, it's a terrible episode. The one with the Vietnam vet who like,
Unrequited,
right? So it's like, you have like this, they're almost like the same episode, it's like these sort of loner guys with a grudge, but they have magical powers. So I think Thief it's almost like a variation on the that theme. I mean, I really like Thief, but again, it's like after first person shooter, it's too jarring. It's too abrupt. These transitions are not smooth. It's like first person shooter is way too broad, and then Thief is like super, super dark, but you also have, again, you have, what's that guy's, it was James Morrison?
Yeah, James Morrison, yeah.
He was on, he was on one of my favorite Millennium episodes, Dead Letters, which is one of my all-time favorites. But, it's funny too, because that's also about perception, right? At the end when he's seeing
all the vans and stuff,
exactly. So, Chimera. So there is like, it's almost like there is a thematic line here that they're very loosely following, right? But I think the chaos behind the scenes and the difficulties on set, as far as the logistical problems and the cost, and then like the fact that the two stars are pretty much in open warfare at this point in time, it just affects everything. And I think that's what leads to Fight Club, though. Like Fight Club is a tantrum, right? But I always call it, it's a private joke that Chris Carter is telling himself. It's like you could just tell that he had it up to here. You know what I mean? And he just writes this like really bizarre temper tantrum, and that's probably like one draft.
Yeah, well, I think we said in the episode that he didn't have much time to write it either, did he? I think he was under pressure, potentially for was it the Lone Gunman? I think he was redrafting or something along those lines, where it was really pushed for time. So the fact it does feel very drafty. I mean, the perfect example of stuff that we pushed up in Fight Club was like, why do you have someone who looks like Mulder and Scully at the beginning of the episode, but everyone else is a doppelganger who looks identical to themselves? It doesn't make much sense, So there's a lot of stuff with Fight Club. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, he loves those doppelgangers. What I mean? That takes. I have no idea what that's about. I have no idea what he means. Like what he's trying to say. Is it like some sort of
Yeah,
quantum?
I quite like that. I could talk about Lynchism. We don't know why, but I quite like the fact we don't know why. Well, because it makes us speculate, doesn't it? So
I think it really works in +1. I really like +1. I think that's one. I got to really admit that I'm not a huge Chris Carter standalone fan, particularly his like novelty comedy episodes. I'm just not a big fan of them. It's kind of like he's incredibly intelligent and he's very well read, but I don't think that's what comedy is about. And it's almost like he's sort of conflicted with himself. I think the episode where I think he really hit the sweet spot was Improbable in season 9. I love that episode. I just think that's phenomenal. And I think that episode, and when you watch it and then watch it again with a director's commentary, just really, really great. But anyway, so like you have a lot of things that I think they were trying to do and they wanted to do. But, when you're tired, when you're exhausted, when you're beyond exhausted, when you reach a state of exhaustion that's beyond exhaustion, the people sitting at home watching it on a Sunday night just don't realize that, these people would literally work around the clock on this thing.
Yeah.
And then you get to a Fight Club and it's just like, it's just clearly, it's all that frustration, when you have to constantly be refereeing these battles between your stars, I mean, you know what I mean? It's just, It's just a real, and then of course, Dave, the episode before that is David taking pot shots at the show saying it's going to become, some stupid Hollywood nonsense after he leaves, right? Hollywood after David, right?
Mm.
But I love that episode, so I'm not gonna badmouth it. I really do like that episode. Legitimately, I like it a lot. One of the things, this through line that we're talking about. I mean, I love Vince Gilligan, phenomenal writer, and he seems like a really great guy. But like when you Je suis or Je soit or Je sweat, I mean, whatever it is, like that. If that's like the penultimate episode of the X-Files. You know what I mean? It's like that's what you have to say. A genie, like Janine Garofalo genie. And I wonder if they try to cast her because the woman who plays her is just playing Janine Garofalo, exactly. Right? Don't you think?
Yeah. Well, I can see that.
So, but it's interesting too because it's like almost like the Sunshine Days it's almost like the same kind of thing. It's like he's exploring sort of the same kind of theme. So it's like, what is he saying? I'd love to pick his brains about what he meant because if that's his last grand statement, what he was meant to be his last grand statement, this is a very strange last grand statement. So anyway, but like I said, I think there's a lot of magical atmosphere in this season. I mean, even in the weaker episodes, it's kind of like there's almost like an aura about them. You know what I mean?
There's definitely like an abstract, as I say, the time thing for me is the one I keep coming back to purely because that indicates stuff like that. The length of time you spend on a scene. One of the things that Carl's mentioned over the course of this season, it's which is something I'm not really factored in, but the more he speaks about it, the more I'm aware of it. Is the what seems to have disappeared from a lot of the shows is because the exact reverse of what we're talking about is that Mulder and Scully, or whoever it may well be in the episode, don't talk about the actual concept or don't actually have deep conversations. So Thief is the one that we talked about quite a bit, which was, there isn't this conversation about science and the actual magic. There's no conversation there. Now there is an element of like Gillian Anderson's, Scully is going through a moment of like trying to be more Mulder-esque, and obviously that will kick in season 8. But it does become apparent through a lot of the writing that there isn't those conversations. There isn't the almost like your two actors coming together in the room.
The case.
And
I think what you mean.
Yeah.
You're talking about like the case. Because the case isn't just like the caper. What David Duchovny called the caper. The case is like the point counterpoint, the philosophical debate that takes place around the caper. And I mean, that's how I interpret what you're saying.
Yeah.
That there isn't this dialectic that you would see in earlier seasons where the story is really, it's not even so much about the caper, it's about the dialectic. It's about these two characters sort of working out their differences. And of course, Mulder's always right, but what are you going to do? That's sort of like, you kind of have to accept that. A lot of these episodes, you sense the very heavy hand of Chris Carter on, particularly when I'm looking at Enemy.
Yeah.
I mean, and Bill Davis just came out right out and said this. It's just like, he found out that, you write your story, you write your script, and then then Chris Carter gets his hands on it. You know what I mean? And it's like, you know, whether you like it or not, and it's going to become his story. It's his show, right? Chimera, there's a ton of Chris in. You know, you can really get that sense. I don't know about Thief so much, but obviously first person shooter, and I think what that has to do with is that a lot of people don't realize that Kill Switch was very, 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 very heavily rewritten. Basically what you had is Gibson and Maddox wrote a premise. And, Rob Bowman talked about this. He saw the script and he's just like, what does he think this is? Is this like, a $200 million feature movie? It's like, this is unfilmable. So a lot of Kill Switch is Chris and Frank, particularly Chris, because Chris basically created that character, the
Invisigoth, is it?
Invisigoth, yeah.
Yeah.
That, because it was a much different character in an earlier draft. And basically, Chris Carter's like, well, William Gibson creates these cool kind of Trinity type characters. Like, why isn't it in this? Because she's supposed to be sort of like this demure, scholarly, like, nerd girl or whatever. So a first person shooter, I don't know how much of the script I think is legitimately awful. And the thing that I really hate about the script is what I really hate about when other people write those characters. I don't mean like other writers on the show, but I mean like when, the comic books, particularly the IDW comic books. I just legitimately hate those comics. And it's because, who was ever writing that stuff just didn't understand these characters at all. But also like some of the novelizations back in the 90s, I mean, they're not bad stories, but it's just like Kevin J. Anderson just did not have that voice. He did not have the voice of these characters in their head. And they just became like generic FBI person 1 and generic FBI person 2, right? You know what I'm saying?
Yep. Yeah.
And that to me, like, that's one of the things when I watch first person shooter, I'm like, who are these characters? You know what I mean? like they're not, it could be what happened is that the script came in, they didn't have time to do rewrites. They're under a lot of pressure trying to get it done. And Chris Carter just said, well, I guess I'll direct it, because I can sort of put my stamp on this somehow, I mean, I would have to go back and see if that was the case, but that's sort of the sense I get that this script, I think they knew that the script was legitimately terrible and not, the voice just wasn't there at all. Like when Mulder goes like this, it's like,
yeah,
shut the hell up.
It actually is my worst episode of the X-Files. I cannot stand first person shoot. I can't get through it.
It's
for a lot
bad.
of that. So,
it is bad,
yeah.
but to me, it's interesting. So it's legitimately bad. But it's also like William Gibson was kind of like, he's running out of juice at that point in time. I was a big Gibson fan back in the day. I don't know if you've ever read any of his books, but I was a huge fan of his early work, particularly those first 4 books, the what they call the Sprawl trilogy, 90% of which shows up in the Matrix.
Yeah.
And then Burning Chrome, which is the short story collection. A huge, huge fan of that stuff. I read those books over and over again. I just loved it. But by this point in time, he, writers, they shoot their wad, and he just had nothing to say anymore. And, you could just tell that this was written by a guy who not only didn't understand these characters really, but just was running out of ideas. He just had nothing left to say. But, I think the interesting thing about it is that it seems like, they wanted to do their own Matrix. That's kind of the sense I get from this. It's like,
yeah.
But it's just shitty and awful and stupid.
I completely agree. So I think we should start to wrap things up, but I think it would be amiss for us not to talk about Requiem as the season and what would then become season 8, but the finale and stuff like that, the way that the Requiem has been written and what do you think of Requiem as an episode and the stuff that happens around it?
I like it a lot better than I used to. I mean, I sort of got like, it was almost like, I used to call it like the last day of school feeling from it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just sort of like, everybody's just like, they know it's the last day of school. So, they go into class, but then just goofing around or whatever. I'm not that anybody was goofing around, but I just got that sense of like, the ending and there wasn't that same engagement, I think on the part of the actors. But that said, I mean, I think it's just a great piece of television writing in that it has to do something. It has to do a lot of things, really. It has to set up this whole world without their main character. And it has to sort of set the stage for that. And I think it just does a brilliant job at it. I think it sort of does it's a really good script in that it closes the door very effectively on, what we saw the first 7 seasons. And then it sets the table for the next one, and it's like, when Chris Carter is engaged, when he wants to write and he has to write something, he's as good as any writer I think there is. I mean, I think it's looking back on it, what I really appreciate about it now and what I appreciate. I mean, I always like the season 8 mythology, but what I really appreciate about it now is just sort of almost like from an objective standpoint, it's just like, this is just really professional, streamlined, writing. They know what they do. They know what they do well. They do best, and they have to move this thing along, and it's just really good. I mean, like 3 words. It's just like it's almost like it's like the platonic ideal of an X-Files episode. You know what I mean? It's just like everything. Of course, there's a lot of callbacks to like Memento Mori and stuff in it, but it just really, really works incredibly well as far as professional, efficient, competent writing. And that's really, so when I look back on Requiem, and, I think that David was just not super engaged in that. And you didn't really get that sort of, that magic from like David and Gillian together, even though you're supposed to, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But the way they did all the callback, obviously all the callbacks to the pilot, was, I mean, I just, from like, if I look at it from a writer's standpoint, like when you're writing isn't just about the art of writing, but it's just like you have to accomplish certain things in a story. You have to do certain things. You have to lay things out in a particular way that makes sense to people. I just think, I think in that regard, as far as like utilitarian writing, let's just say, it's as good as anything I've ever seen. And I mean that, because it just does a lot and it does it well. Yeah. And I think that's why a lot of fans will say, well, that should have been the last episode. And I understand why. I just think, I love season 8. So
yeah.
And I really wouldn't have wanted to end on that. I wouldn't want to end like if that was the end of the series, I'd be like, eh.
In what sense? The fact that Mulder is taken away, or just because obviously you get like the Twin Peaks kind of Annie thing with that, don't you? No. Or is it something different?
It's just like the taste in the mouth, like just the way it ended. It's almost sort of like it did not end at its showing its best side to the world. I think season 8 from start to finish. Even the episodes that I think are really boring, like Medusa, right?
Yep. I like Medusa. So.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people, I really love not salvage, short kill. I think short kill is phenomenal, and a lot of people hate it. So, it's just, everybody's taste is different. Yeah. But whether the episodes, are engaging to me now or engaging to me then. I just remember like when they just sort of like, they were clearing the decks before they got into the big second half, when it's, Short Kill, Savage, and Bad Law, and Medusa. It's just like, this is like, those are the leftovers, that they're serving one after the other, usually in other seasons, like all those were like really sort of weak second tier episodes would sort of be, paced more, but like putting them all together, I think wasn't the best idea. But even if I don't like really feel that those are engaging, exciting stories, they're all incredibly professionally made.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like the X-Files when they, Bob Goodwin had talked about that in the, that interview he did recently. When he's talking about like, Chris Carter just didn't know what you could do and couldn't do. He just didn't understand that like there are things you can do and can't do. So like he would write these stories and instead of saying we can't do them, we figured out a way to do them, and that sort of ups the game. But I think every episode, starting with Requiem really is just very streamlined, professional. Chris Carter wasn't being sort of, his attention wasn't being taken away from the lawsuit or from Harsh Realm or from fighting with Fox or whatever. It's just like, you really get a sense that he's fully engaged, I think, in a way that he hadn't been with that series since the third season. What I mean? I don't think that he was.
It's quite surprising. Well, not surprising. It's my favorite seasons are 3, then 8. So, and I don't think that's any surprise really with what you've just said.
Well, yeah, I mean, because Carter's favorite season is 3 too. It's interesting too, because you say that those are your favorite. Because like, I believe Frank has said that his favorite season was 8. And Chris Carter had said that his favorite season was 3. So
I'm in good company then.
Yeah, but with 8 too. I mean, I thought The Lone Gunman was terrible. I was truly bad. Like Harsh Realm is bad. It's a bad show, and I love to hate it. But just because it's so clunky and cringy. But Lone Gunman is just awful. It's just terrible. And, the thing that's really disappointing about it is that, that was basically Vince Gilligan show running that.
Yeah.
But comedy is really, really, really hard to write. And when you're like a dramatic writer like he is, when you really, you can write great comedy, but your real strength is in drama. Running a show that's an ostensible comedy, I would have kept the tone of the pilot. You know what I mean? I would have you would have the comic relief, but you would have serious stories. They just made it the Three Stooges, and it's just awful. And it just gets worse as time goes on. Like when I go back and watch those episodes, I'm like, what the hell were they thinking? This is truly, truly, truly television that is awful. It's like Harsh Realm tries and fails. Right? It's trying to do a lot of things, and it's trying to do too much, so it fails. Lone Gunman is just a pile of shit. It's just awful. You know what I mean? It's just stupid. And I don't know. But, Frank has said that he just felt that it was too late in the series' life. The Lone Gunman really should have been a series like in the 4th season. You know what I mean? When those characters still sort of had a cachet and they just weren't like sort of holdovers, But, the thing is that the 1013 mystique was really hurt by Harsh Realm and was hurt by Lone Gunman because those were just 2 outright bombs. Millennium, I think a lot of people didn't like Millennium, right? But I don't think anybody thought Millennium was bad television. It's just it wasn't to their taste, let's just say.
Yeah, I've never heard anyone outright say it's like what you're saying, like it's awful or horrible, or most people haven't seen it, if I'm being honest, but they would say, oh, it's now trying to become X-Files, season 3. I don't know, we've talked about it on the other podcast, but you're right. I don't think I've never really heard like a real bad critique of it, as in like it's horrible, it's horrendous. Yeah, you've had season 1, it's dark, it's serial killer of the week kind of thing, but no, I've never heard it in those terms.
Yeah, and I think it's true. So that really sullied the brand, And I think sort of that 1-2 punch of like Harsh Realm in season 7, and then Lone Gunman in season 8, and then like season 9, listen, I know a lot of people hate season 9. I'll defend it. I really will. I mean, most of the mythology episodes are just really terrible, but that's what happens when you finish a story and then you have to start it up again. You know what I mean? It's just, it's inevitable. But like, 4D, John Doe.
Yeah. I watched John Doe recently. I still love that episode.
Yeah.
4D John Doe. Underneath's great. I like Aquatic Underneath.
Yeah, absolutely. But,
Audrey Pauly.
The thing that I really felt, when I started watching season 9 and I watched Nothing Interesting Happened This Episode, part 1, and it's just awful. And I don't know who was doing the rewrite on that, but it's clearly not Chris Carter because it's just not his voice. You can definitely hear his voice again on the second, it's like, and I know he hadn't resigned. I don't know who was doing the rewrites on that because, like when like tit in a ringer, like he would never say that. There's a lot, there's a lot of sort of salty language and you're just like, no, this is not X-Files. But, so I skipped the second episode, which, and it's the second Nothing Important Happened Today is like light years better than the first. And I think that the first episode is just legitimately terrible. And then I watched Daimonicus. And I really like Daimonicus, but I'm just like, this is Millennium.
Yeah.
It's like you've got Rob Patrick playing Lance, and then you've got Annabeth playing Lara Means. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Scully is just sort of like, I don't know, one of the background characters, And this is just season 2 Millennium. Straight up, because I was thinking like Pest House, you know what I mean? Like something like that.
Yeah.
And I was just like, what? I'm an X-Files fan. And at that point in time, I wasn't the Millennium fan that I became later. And I was like, whatever. And I skipped everything up until Underneath. And then I watched Underneath, and I really liked Underneath too. But I'm like, it's still Millennium. It's just another Millennium episode. But no, I really, when I actually sat down and watched those episodes together, I enjoyed it. There are episodes that I don't enjoy rewatching, but I enjoyed watching them the first time. I like the only episode that I just really hated in that last season was the last season was the season opener, and everything else I thought was either just okay or
serviceable.
Good.
Yeah. I think that I do think it's serviceable for a lot of the episodes. There may not be, there's episodes I'm like, oh, what happened there? There's something happened there, but I'm looking forward to doing season 9. I know
I'll
a lot
tell
of
you
people
something.
aren't, but
Robert Patrick acted his ass off. So, like, even if it's just a really bad story, I just really enjoy his performances. He was that character. He embodied it. He loved that. He said that's his favorite character that he ever played. And I think he really played it well.
Any final thoughts then on what we've just witnessed over the past season, season 7? What are your final thoughts on the show?
My final thoughts would be sort of my opening thoughts is that it's just a wildly inconsistent season of television, but the good episodes are really good. You know what I mean? And I think the mythology, for me personally, was like the most solid it had been since the third season. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And actually, I'm more partial to like the second season mythology than the third season. So I just think that it felt like stories again, and not just like chapters in a John le Carre novel. You know what I mean? It felt like the X-Files again. So there are some real stinkers. And there's some episodes that I don't mind that people hate, like All Things. I think Je Suis is cute, but it's not an X-Files episode. It feels like almost another show.
Yeah.
With Janine Garofalo as the star. Janine Garofalo stars in The Genie,
That's going to stick.
Yeah. But, it's all the episodes are worth watching at least once, even if you don't like them, it's still that X-Files machine running pretty smoothly.
Yeah.
Relatively, at least the operational side of it. And the episodes that are really good, and they're episodes that people don't talk about. Like I really like Rush, and I really like Hungry, and I really like Chimera. You know what I mean? I like Thief. Sort of looking at the. I love her. I mean, there were like episodes, standalones in this season that I legitimately really, really like. You know, like I said, like Chimera and Hungry. But I legitimately like Horizon. You know, but then again, I like Kitsunagari better than Pusher. So,
Tony will have your head.
Oh yeah, I'm running for my life from him. I'm actually in an undisclosed bunker in the middle of Nebraska right now because I'm trying to avoid Tony Black's wrath.
No, I would agree. I mean, just with you talking there, I think season 6, I equate it to almost like a one of those albums that somebody would produce, maybe third or fourth album that they've done, where it feels like it's just a selection of hits. It just feels like they've just put singles together rather than a cohesive album. That's what I feel like season 6 is like. Season 7, the way you've said it there, I think is similar. I think there's moments where it's like it's really, really good, another moment it's really bad, and there is some of that kind of sort of album kind of aspect to it. But you're right. I think for me, it's up and down. It doesn't seem to have like a happy medium, and it's just unbalanced. And I mean, season 7, I was thinking about this last night about where I would put it in my list, and it would be towards the bottom of the entire run out of the 11 seasons. But having said that, I mean, I would always say that X-Files is, I mean, and I would include season 9 in this, that a really bad X-File is still, you know, worth watching in some regard, for whatever reason it may well be. And, you know, there is elements to the X-Files which is still good to watch, and it's still, you know, there. So it being at the bottom of my list doesn't mean it's bad television. And you've hit the nail on the head. There's some fantastic albums, fantastic stories in this. Requiem, as you say, is really tightly concise. I spoke about that on the podcast. You know, I really like All Things as a theme piece. I think the mood of it is fantastic. You know, we've got things like, you know, as you say, reevaluating Chimera, for example. It's something that I've done in history, but I haven't talked about in this season. But even then, like reviewing like the Millennium stuff, as I say, the kind of hangover from that with Orison Signs and Wonders and stuff like that, which work to its good point. And, you know, things like Brand X, which kind of brings in some of the conspiracy stuff. So there's a lot in there, but I just feel that sometimes, and I think your thing about the themes, about, you know, the point of view storytelling, some of the aspects of like Ex-Cops and Closure Design on Zeit being that ethereal kind of aspect to it, I think really works quite well. So it's a really mixed bag, season 7, and I think I used it last night. I tweeted out and I said intriguing is probably the word I would use. And everything behind the scenes as well. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating year of television.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I just want to pick up what we were saying about the albums, because I have this sort of pet theory that I've been mulling around of like comparing seasons of the X-Files to Beatles albums. So when you said like season 6 would be like Sgt. Pepper for me.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And like season 5 is Magical Mystery Tour, you know. Bear with me here. So season 7 is kind of like the White Album, right? And season 8 is Abbey Road, and season 9 is Let It Be. Okay? Think about that. Think about that for a while. Kind of works, right? I haven't gone all about, you know, because there are more Beatles albums to take into account. But maybe if we just start with, I don't know, like Help or something, you know, would be, you know, the touchstone. But it's you know, that's very facetious, obviously, but it's kind of like the same arc, you know, in when art becomes a phenomenon. It almost like it follows the same arc. So like the Beatles album sort of corresponding to these X-Files season makes sense to me in the way that this is what happens to artists when the art is almost taken away from them and given to the world at large. And you know, how do you cope with that? You know what I mean? You know, I think that really I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, I really do. I think it makes a lot of sense in that regard, because you go from like just somebody sort of hammering away in your little typewriter well, maybe one day I can sell this story. Oh, somebody will love me. Yay. You know what I mean? To like, 25 million tuning in. You're still a person. You're still the same person. Like, how does that affect you?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, how does that affect your mind? And, Chris Carter and a lot of the others said, it didn't affect us at all because we were just working 18-hour days and the same as we ever were, So I don't know, but you have to become conscious of it when you see your face. Like maybe he was working 18 hours a day, but he still went to like the drugstore and saw, his star's face on every magazine,
Yeah.
That's got to affect you in some way. So I think season 7 is like the way in which it succeeds. I'll just say this. Where it succeeds is when it sticks to its core strengths. Where it fails is when it moves away from its core strengths. And I think if you look at that season, I think that's a pretty good summation of it. It's like when they're doing meat and potatoes X-Files, it works. When they're trying to do that season 6 thing again, it fails because it's just a different time. Everything is different than it was in season 6. So it's kind of like, they learned their lesson in the season that like, all right, well, let's just stick to the core. Let's just do what we do best. And that's what they did in season 8.
Okay. Well, I think that's a perfect time to wrap up for this hour. So if people are wanting some more from you, Chris, where can people find you online?
Just go to secretsun.blogspot.com and that will point you in all the directions you need to go.
Excellent. So, okay. So thank you very much. We'll see you in season 8. So again, as I say, really looking forward to doing that. We'll be starting to prep that in the near future. With time recording, we're just in the end of November. So I think before Christmas, we'll have mapped out what we're going to do. But to be honest, if I'm being absolutely honest here, that when we finished Requiem, I started to get excited. The fact that we're now coming into season 8, and it's don't get me wrong, I love talking on the Xcast, but the fact that season 8 is coming now is really starting to excite me. So I'm really looking forward to doing it. But you can find me on Twitter at rmuldrake. That's at RMULDRAKE. So you can find me on various different podcasts as well as the Xcast. I've got The Time Is Now. We've recently had a discussion with Glenn Morgan when we were in Birmingham a few weeks ago. So that we had a fantastic discussion with him. And that will be coming out, I think, to Patreon soon. And we had a good show there. So there'll be some specials coming along as well. We've had the commentary on... what was the commentary we had on? Commentary on the pilot, commentary on Curse of Frank Black, and coming up we'll have the commentary on Midnight of the Century for Millennium. And you can also find me on the Red Dwarf podcast, which is Shipwrecked and Comatose, and you can find that at Red Dwarf Pod. The X-Files isn't what we're talking about in We Made This Podcast Network. You'll hear some more shows at the end of this, just some highlights for some recent episodes from various different shows on the network. But until next time, remember everyone, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. We dig music.
I feel that this is the first song that properly ripped into R. Kelly as well.
Which is amazing.
Wow.
Yeah. Right, so R. Kelly has
bang on time.
Only just been convicted.
Yeah.
The first time I ever heard of R. Kelly was reading Smash Hits. So this is before I'd even started reading Kerrang. So I started getting Kerrang in 95, so this must have been 94.
Yep.
And it was when...
he married Aaliyah, who was 14
Yeah,
at the
basically Aaliyah had just released her album Age Ain't Nothing But a Number.
The Movie Palace Podcast.
The book I want to tell you about is The Art of American Screen Acting, 1912 to 1960, by Dan Callahan. What I try to do in my movie programs is introduce people to films they haven't seen, and some of these people are younger viewers who haven't watched a lot of classic cinema, especially anything predating Star Wars. They'll often make comments like, "I really like the movie, but the acting back then was pretty awful." The Art of American Screen Acting meets such comments head on.
Observing the Pattern, a Fringe podcast. So there is a real element of redemption. You know, we talk about William Bell getting redemption in this episode, or redeeming himself for his actions with his sacrifice, but the whole arc of Fringe is in many ways Walter redeeming himself as well, and realising what he's done wrong, for one thing, and realising where he's gone wrong and coming to terms with that. So yeah, this is a very key point, I think, in that whole macro story of Fringe, as well as Walter's character.
Yeah, definitely. And there's also an element that we discussed in a previous episode about the weaponization of children.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The X-Cast, an X-Files podcast, was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the X-Cast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the X-Cast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the X-Cast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening and keep watching the skies.